Hi, I'm Carol.
And I'm Holly, and we are the hosts of Fireside Phantoms.
On our podcast, we will delight in telling you stories of the strange, twisted, dark, and foreboding.
Creepy, crawly things slinking up your leg.
Ghostly hands reaching out from beyond the grave.
And we will ask hard-hitting questions like,
can Slender Man fit into my skinny jeans?
Who is Wrinkles the Clown, and how can he make your child's next birthday party special?
Why shouldn't we invite the black-eyed kids in?
What really is going on at your creepy neighbor's house, and is it okay to peek inside?
And many, many more.
So join us and our forest friends
as we gather around a warm and crackling campfire. This is Fireside Phantoms.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and today I'm going to start a journey exploring the cultish troubled teen industry across America, how it came to be, and that it was primarily modelled after Synanon, a cult I covered recently. If you haven't listened to this episode, I recommend quickly going back and having a listen so we can all start this journey at the same place. The tale begins in 1967 when Palm Springs furniture store owner Mel Wasserman looks at Synanon and the model of Synanon and realises that this framework holds the potential to make millions of dollars, not through recruiting willing adults, drug addicts, or adult patients sent from the health sector, but through children. Boarding schools for children, or private residential treatment facilities for, quote, troubled teens. These children would be sent from the court systems and psychiatrists. What would happen in these schools, the stories and testimonies, sound as though they come straight from a horror movie or someone's idea of hell. Listen closely as we explore the birth of CEDU and the terrors it inflicted and still inflicts on thousands of children throughout America and the world. Before we jump in, I have a small piece of business. I wanted to give a shout out to all the special people who have donated to an active fundraiser I have, which is enabling me to continue podcasting full time now that my maternity leave has ended. So thank you so much to Wendy, Meg, Lois, Lucy, Sue, Georgia, Jackie, John, Haley, and Tamara. Not only are you allowing me more time at home with my son, but you're also allowing me the opportunity to continue my passion of podcasting. Part 1 of this series was Synanon. This is part 2 where I will talk you through the history and timeline of CEDU, a cult for teens that was created in Synanon's image. Part 3 and potentially even part 4 will be spent speaking with survivors of this cult, talking through and exploring their experiences and how adults put themselves in positions of power to abuse children who are stuck in isolated environments where children are forced to endure abuse. A lot of the information I use today is provided by these same survivors. I thank you for taking the time to send me this information and for giving me your blessing to use it. 2 of those people I will interview next episode. A survivor of CEDU who addresses himself as Medium Anonymous released an investigative piece on CEDU. A lot of this piece was Medium trying to find out how and why CEDU was able to run for as long as it did without being shut down for child abuse or child endangerment. Yet upon contacting an endless list of provisions from Child Protective Services all the way through to the District Attorney's Office, no one was able to offer him solid answers to his questions. He too has given me permission to use his research and content to make this episode possible. It does come with a trigger warning of child sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental and verbal abuse, and child endangerment, missing persons, suicide, and murder. CEDU starts with Mel. Mel Wasserman, born 1932 in Cleveland, Ohio, was a businessman, entrepreneur, and founder of CEDU Education. According to peoplepill.com, he was a pioneer in the unaccredited therapeutic boarding school industry, who used cult doctrines as their philosophical base. On the EN Academic website, it tells us that Wasserman grew up in Los Angeles, California, and attended Fairfax High School. Wasserman married his wife Bridget in 1963 after having 3 children, Mark, Dana and Stacy, from a previous marriage. They first lived in Palm Springs, California, and later split their time between Sandpoint, Idaho and Carmel, California. Wasserman was introduced to Synanon in 1962, a year before his marriage to Bridget. As we discovered from the episode I released this month, he was a Palm Springs furniture store owner at this time, who often had members of Synanon over at his residence. Synanon is described in the freedictionary.com as a method of psychotherapy for treating drug addicts originally practiced in the drug rehabilitation centres of the Synanon organisation. We know that this organisation was started by the gruff Charles E. Dederick, nicknamed Chuck, who from a bout of spinal meningitis was left with a lazy eye and a facial tic. Chuck founded Synanon, originating out of his small one-bed home, and then to a small shopfront before turning it into one of the largest empires of its time. Within Synanon, ex-drug addicts, which he called drug fiends, would live, and each would join in with a phenomenon known as the game. The game consisted of participants sitting in a semicircle with one person standing. That person would then be verbally attacked by the group, one at a time. This person would have their personality, clothing, looks, family members, wives, husbands, children, and anything else conceivable absolutely torn to shreds. If they tried to defend themselves, the entire group would join in with the verbal onslaught. Synanon would eventually turn from a rehabilitation program for drug addicts to its own community. And eventually, Chuck would force his members into abortions, vasectomies, shaved heads, divorces, and matching with new partners. Wasserman was known within Synanon as a square. The term referred to somebody who was a part of Synanon but not an ex-addict, somebody who just wanted to be a part of the lifestyle. Many squares were part of Synanon, and these people actually paid a fee to remain a part of this movement, whereas drug fiends worked for their keep. Wasserman had Synanon groups over at his home in Palm Springs to play the game. It is alleged that during this time, Wasserman met ex-drug addict Bill Lane, who had been a part of Synanon since almost the beginning. This is where Wasserman and Lane became close friends. After 5 years of involvement with Synanon in 1967, Wasserman and Lane started noticing that Dederick was changing. His vision of Synanon, amidst its massive success, had undergone a seismic shift. It was at this time that Mel and Bill were pushed out of Synanon along with the majority of the old guard, allowing the imposition of more radical methods and ideas. Mel and Bill, having been pushed out of the inner Synanon circle, but seeing massive income potential from Synanon's model, had got together and started the Charles Earl Dederick University. Mel as the founder, and Bill as the president. Out of that very same living room that he had hosted the game so many times before, Mel started having teenagers over at his home where they would play the game. This is very similar to Synanon's start in Chuck's humble abode before moving to the storefront. A year later, in 1968, Wasserman sold his furniture business and, along with some investment assistance, bought the Running Springs Lodge, built and formerly owned by Walter Houston, a titan of Hollywood at the time. In this same year, Mel and Bridget founded the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, or BGCA, in Monterey. BGCA, according to Wikipedia, is a national organisation of local chapters which provide voluntary after-school programs for young people. The organisation, which holds a congressional charter under Title 36 of the United States Code, has its headquarters in Atlanta, with regional offices in Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, New York City, and Los Angeles. BGCA is tax-exempt and partially funded by the federal government. The first boys' club was founded in 1860 in Hartford, Connecticut, by 3 women named Elizabeth Hamilsey and sisters Mary and Alice Goodwin. In 1906, 53 independent boys' clubs came together in Boston to form a national organisation, the Federated Boys' Club. In 1931, the organisation renamed itself Boys Clubs of America, and in 1990 to Boys and Girls Clubs of America. As of 2010, there are over 4,000 autonomous local clubs, which are affiliates of the national organisation. In total, these clubs serve more than 4 million boys and girls. Clubs can be found in all 50 states, as well as locations in Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and US military bases. In total, Boys and Girls Clubs of America employ about 50,000 staff members. The Chronicle of Philanthropy ranked Boys and Girls Clubs of America number 1 among youth organizations for the 13th consecutive year, and number 12 among all non-profit organizations. The Boys and Girls Clubs of America is the official charity of Major League Baseball. Denzel Washington, a former club member, has been the spokesperson for Boys and Girls Clubs of America since 1993. The BGCA website boasts our mission to enable all young people, especially those who need us most, to reach their full potential as productive, caring, responsible citizens. Our vision: provide a world-class club experience that assures success is within reach of every young person who enters our doors, with all members on track to graduate from high school with a plan for the future, demonstrating good character and citizenship, and living a healthy lifestyle. Our commitment to inclusion: we believe every kid has what it takes. The mission and core beliefs of Boys and Girls Clubs fuel our commitment to promoting safe, positive, and inclusive environments for all. Boys and Girls Clubs of America supports youths and teens of every race, ethnicity, gender expression, sexual orientation, ability, socioeconomic status, and religion in reaching their full potential. This sounds like an ideal program full of support and the potential to flourish, much like what CEDU was selling, but unfortunately, it seems as though Mel Wasserman didn't take enough inspiration from the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. Instead, they labelled their curriculum and modules within CEDU as emotional growth. What many didn't know was that their curriculum in offering an education for children was also a lie. Wasserman and Lane built a scholastic model of Synanon for adolescents, bringing back the graduation philosophy that Synanon had dropped at the beginning of Phase 2, and designed a 2 to 3 year program mirroring the old Synanon. During this time, Dederick and the new Synanon, or Synanon 2, seemed to be mirroring Wasserman and Lane, as Dederick himself began to accept court and parent-appointed children. From an LA Mag article in 2018, it reads, 1969, Wasserman and Lane saw the profit potential in this popular growing trust of Synanon and its approach to addiction treatment. And as true believers of the model, Wasserman incorporated CEDU as he purchased the Houston Lodge in Running Springs. Unlike Synanon, however, CEDU incorporated as an as-for-profit company. Throughout the 1970s, CEDU flourished, and its methods and history were closely intertwined with that of Synanon. As Dederick upped the intensity and duration of his game workshops. Just as a note here, I believe this is in reference to the trip which we looked at during the Synanon episode, workshops that lasted for days and often used LSD. Wasserman also evolved his programs to include a series of workshops that he dubbed Profeets, like profit with an extra E. These appear to be named after the book The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, whose works are heavily cited in the Profeets, although there is no official affiliation. CEDU's growth was fueled through increasing instability of Dederick and Synanon's plunging reputation, combined with notable people such as Mark Hughes, the founder of Herbalife, being sent to the program by his parents and later staying on to sell the CEDU school to other parents and addict teens. In fact, during its development and throughout its existence, the primary source of staff recruiting was graduates of the CEDU program, enabling a truly closed culture. Very few of these employees possessed degrees in education or mental health, let alone basic certifications, their only requirement for employment being their experiences as a student and belief in the method and program and belief in Mel Wasserman. It was described in the media in the 60s as the fountain of youth for youth. Sometime in the late 70s, as the profits were rolling in and CEDU prepared for an expansion, Synanon itself was imploding. And the motto, see yourself as you want to be and do something about it, was born to explain away the CEDU name, and ties with Synanon ended. Any visible connection appeared to have been erased. But Synanon lived on within CEDU until 2005, and in some form even exists today. The media were extremely quick to accept this new explanation of CEDU's name, never questioning the Synanon link and understanding that CEDU, despite literally spelling Charles Earl Dederick's initials, apparently actually stood for CEDU. C-U, do something, which is spelt nothing like CEDU. EAacademic.com goes on to say, after starting work with troubled teens in his home in Palm Springs, Mel decided to sell his furniture business and invest in a school to help teenagers. Success of the CEDU program was dramatic and it rapidly expanded into other specialized educational programs. Mel surrounded himself with educators and professionals and educated himself in the field of adolescent behavior. The philosophy he brought to CEDU was strict adherence to his set of principles, notably accountability and boundaries. He has been quoted as saying to students and parents, "Take away boundaries and bring in a sewer, a biker society. The magic is not in the building itself, it is in the setting of boundaries, a certain posture and a certain way we act inside them, and then we have something which facilitates what we are trying to do here." It should be noted here that this website says that Mel surrounded himself with educators and professionals. That wasn't always the case. As we mentioned before, CEDU was run mostly by ex-residents who have no formal education or appropriate licensing or training to work in a rehabilitation program for adolescents. Further on thepeoplepill.com, the early success of the CEDU program, because it was dramatic, was possibly due to the massive profit potential that Mr. Wasserman realised by charging in excess of $6,000 per month per student while hiring non-credentialed, troubled, low-wage adults as staff. Although there is no proof of this, Mr. Wasserman allegedly surrounded himself with educators and professionals and educated himself in the field of adolescent behaviour. Again, it goes on to mention that the philosophy he brought to CEDU was strict adherence to his set of principles. But this was administered to unsupervised teenagers by troubled former drug addicts and sexual deviants. Although the idea of boundaries was constantly blurred by adults sharing lurid tales of the adult teachers' troubled pasts, including drug and deviant sexual activity, with captive minor children. The idea of boundaries was constantly blurred by adults sharing their lurid tales of their own personal troubled pasts, including drug and sexual deviancy. Mel Wasserman, professional furniture salesman, had no credentials, qualifications or licenses to run a boarding school for troubled children, adolescents or otherwise at-risk minors. Mel Wasserman also exposed the children to adults posing as class teachers who also had no credentials, qualifications or licenses to instruct children or adolescents, and were in fact former drug addicts and people with divergent sexuality. The Synanon therapeutic methods have not been established as having long-term positive lifestyle-changing effects. Any critical read of the above biography of Mel Wasserman illuminates the complete and total lack of certification, qualification, long-term double-blind study of the efficacy of the Synanon therapeutic model, as well as the incredibly bad idea of having unqualified, troubled adults in contact with minor children with no professional supervision. I found an article on a website called litsdit.com that included a lengthy CEDU timeline that was noted to be a work in progress. It includes detailed events of CEDU that I will briefly run through to give you an idea of how this program started from one man's living room to becoming an entire kingdom that made millions of dollars off the back of child abuse. CEDU timeline, the Wasserman years. Founded by Mel Wasserman, he first began listening to kids and interacting with them in the 60s when he lived in Palm Springs. This somehow morphed into parents paying Mel to take their kids and turn them into, hopefully, solid adults. In 1967, Running Springs, California, Wasserman sells his furniture business in Palm Springs and with some support opens Running Springs CEDU High School as a for-profit entity. In 1972, Mark Hughes, the Herbalife founder, is sent to CEDU by his father. Part of the recovery was to sell raffle tickets door to door. Hughes stays on after his graduation, selling the CEDU school to parents. After this, some newspapers would begin looking at CEDU more, A segment from the Billboard magazine in 1973 reads, CEDU is a public, non-profit corporation functioning as a rehabilitation centre for emotionally disturbed youths who have serious drug involvements. Medium Anonymous goes on to say in his article here that the only non-profit part of this experience was that the residents weren't allowed to hold any of their own money. In 1974, Bill Lane officially begins working for Mel Wasserman. During the 70s, the media promotion for CEDU has the tagline of Youth-Orientated Drug Rehabilitation Centre that is run by former drug addicts no older than 25. In 1982, CEDU expands into the Washington state, opening the Rocky Mountain Academy. This is located in Naples, Idaho. In 1983, Lon Woodbury becomes admissions director for CEDU's Rocky Mountain Academy. Lon Woodbury would later be one of the people who would savagely defend CEDU and Mel Wasserman against CEDU survivors. In 1987, Mount Bachelor Academy is founded by College Heath Enterprises. This is not a CEDU enterprise. The founder would later join a CEDU enterprise, and before this was even commonly linked to CEDU because of charges and allegations brought against this school. There was a dress-up role-playing charge related to one experience that included a 6-day workshop in what was called the Summit at CEDU. In 1990, CEDU High School is accredited by WASC, which is also known as the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. By the 90s, CEDU began launching a new tagline that said the nation's first emotional growth boarding school that included an involuntary 2-year program. In 1991, CEDU High School expands to open a middle school. CEDU would take on children from as young as 8. In 1999, Bill Lane establishes Bill Lane Associates, which is a transport service that essentially kidnaps children in the dead of night to transport them to their new home within a troubled teen school. They transport children all over the world, according to their website, and they are still very much active and flourishing today. In 1993, there is a news release of a 17-year-old boy who has disappeared from a CEDU campus. He is never found. Also in 1993, Boulder Creek Academy started. This would be the third CEDU school, and it was located in Bonners Ferry, Idaho. In 1993, Rocky Mountain Academy changes its policies, and it will now accept children on psychotropic medication, meaning antidepressants, medication for bipolar, ADHD medications, etc. By July 1994, John A. commits suicide in one of the dormitories of Lower Camelot at Rocky Mountain Academy. In 1994, Northwest Academy is founded. Its purpose is to get troubled, but not too troubled, high school juniors and seniors to finish high school and have the skills to go on to college effectively. Also in 1994, Ascent, CEDU's Therapeutic Wilderness Program, is founded. Continuing in 1994, a CEDU middle school opens in California. In the news, a 14-year-old boy disappears from the campus. The family believes that he was abducted. He has still not been found. In 1997, a riot at the Northwest Academy in which 5 students are injured takes place, and the Boundary County Sheriff's Department is called in. In November of the same year, a new institution comes under the spotlight with CEDU. The name is Brown Schools. They become a key player in CEDU's history. The Brown Schools terminated 29 employees in a broad-based reduction of its workforce. William H. Betcher III and co-worker Diane Roper were among those terminated. Betcher was 65 years old and Roper was 60. On August 11, 1998, Betty Roper, a female, filed a sex and age discrimination suit. Also in 1997, the Brown Schools North American Boarding Schools Division begins planning a new boarding school. And then, at the Northwest Academy, a new venture of the CEDU family of educational services is announced. In 1998, April Kevin Akamatsu's family and Stanton Lewis file suits against CEDU for maltreatment in the Idaho programs, including the riot in 1997. In the 90s, CEDU experiences financial difficulties and complaints against the school and staff for mistreatment. Medium Anonymous points out here in his article that these are the same complaints that he could trace back to the 60s. In July of 1998, the Brown Schools purchases CEDU, which at this time includes 5 boarding schools and a wilderness program, for $78 million. At this stage, Mel Wasserman is still alive. Medium Anonymous describes a CEDU underground forming, which is made up of concerned counsellors at Running Springs who report the abuse to Child Protective Services and the San Bernardino District Attorney's Office. But it appears that any staff who questioned the methods of CEDU were quietly ushered out. They either quit or were fired. These complaints against CEDU never appeared to have gone any further than occasional questioning with zero follow-up. In 1998, Brown School's division, North American Boarding Schools, opens St. George School for kids who are struggling but not yet in the deep hole of the CEDU program. Founder Lisa Houghton is adamant that King George School is not a therapeutic school, and thus any diagnosis of a child is usually incidental to what she is looking for in prospective students. She sees King George School as a regular boarding school that accepts the fact all teens have mental, emotional, and physical needs in order to grow up. Her vision is that old institutions such as family, church, and community weaken. Something needs to replace them in order to help teens make changes needed to become successful adults. She feels a new vision of boarding schools is necessary to help their students compensate for the increasing absence of one in the older, weakening institutions. In 1999, Friends of CEDU Foundation is started by husband and wife Howard and Cheryl, and by Joel Harowitz, to assist families who faced having to remove a child prior to graduation, because the CEDU tuition was far more than any family could continue to pay or finance. On October 26, 1999, the Brown Schools announced the placement of $15 million of subordinated debt with Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association of America, or TIAA. The purpose of the debt is to continue its expansion efforts and remain a leader in providing education, behavioural services to the country's youth. We are accelerating the Brown School's growth plan and felt that TIAA would make a strong strategic partner, said Thomas P. Riley, Chairman and CEO. To have secured such a long-term relationship with someone of TIAA's reputation is important to us. Our discussions with them have focused on the availability of capital for growth on a greenfield basis as well as through acquisitions. TIAA is excited about the company's growth prospects. TIAA's investment will finance current expansions of the company's education group to include operations in Vermont, Nebraska, Houston, and Dallas, Texas. It also provides for expansion of programs and services in Idaho and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico that are assigned to its specialty behavioral group. In July of 2000, there is a parent uprising at King George School with mass staff resignations which are criticised and rebutted by leaders. By January 2002, there is a dwindling demand for a 30-month programme, so Northwest Academy becomes only 12 months long. You finish high school with academic and emotional growth programmes. In this same year, Mel Wasserman would die comfortably in his sleep. An article on strugglingteens.com written by former employee of CEDU, Dan Earle, reads, "How does one even begin to pay tribute to Mel Wasserman, the founder of CEDU Education? As I write, thousands of others like myself all over the United States, Canada and beyond are reflecting on the contribution he made to their individual lives as educators, parents, students. His imprint is here forever. I can say without question that my life and my career took a radical departure in 1975 when I joined CEDU School tucked away in the mountains of Southern California. I joined CEDU to implement my thesis for my master's degree in education designed to integrate wilderness adventure into a therapeutic program. During my internship interview, I was struck by the sense that something extraordinary was stirring in this tranquil place. I was well versed in Dewey's contribution to education and recently had been studying Kurt Hahn, the founder of the International Outward Bound movement. However, their influence could only touch me through books. Then, with the introduction to Mel, I found myself swept into the centre of a river of educational ideas that were moving at life speed, which was Mel's term. Mel was an imposing figure, and the imprint of his ideas and philosophy of education was in evidence everywhere in the cultural movement of CEDU. The story of Mel and his wife Bridget having started CEDU in their home in Palm Springs, California in 1967 was already a legend in the school's history. Monday evenings we would all gather, all students and all faculty, to hear him speak. The room was always filled with a certain electricity and anticipation of how our individual and school life might change as he revealed his latest insights. Change and growth was something I was just beginning to comprehend. In those days, a requirement for any new faculty member was full participation in CEDU program of personal growth. Little did I realise this agreement would launch me on the most dramatic, challenging and rewarding journey of my life. I had yet to read Emerson's essay on Self-Reliance, where he states, "There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better for worse as his portion, that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which he has been given to him to till." But under Mel's guidance, I was to discover the meaning of these profound words. Mel was actively tilling and planting an educational philosophy that would years later become a movement, long before the world would become familiar with the phrase, "the child within." Mel was creating an education whose core was dedicated to, in his words, the liberation of the child within all of us. 3 decades before the term emotional quotient would appear acknowledging the importance of emotions, Mel was pioneering the creation of an educational approach that would address equality, the development of an individual's emotional knowledge, as well as one's intellectual capacity, civic participation, and personal responsibility. To know oneself, to have the freedom to dream and the tools to achieve those dreams were an integral part of the education he felt everyone deserved. Ironically, Mel was proud to state that he was a self-educated man, and he encouraged faculty, regardless of their credentials, to become self-educated as well. To live or work at CEDU was to grow, and the education was not just for the students. He often reminded us that you are not the teacher, you are the lesson. In group training sessions, he would inquire of us individually, what are you teaching? Who are you? Where are you going? And how will you get there? During the 1970s, Mel spoke of a golden age of education and that each of us had an opportunity to make a contribution to the collective knowledge of this age. He would state, "At this moment, we are at the white-hot centre of the development of a philosophy and approach to education that will live long after our own individual experience." During this golden age, the idea of a holistic, integral education was born. It is one that addressed with the foundation of self-understanding through an emotional growth curriculum, running parallel to an academic, civic and wilderness curriculum grounded in experience, of which Dewey and Hahn would both have approved. The development and application of an emotional growth curriculum, based on the sequence of a child's development, created an opportunity for adolescents to review their past in developmental stages and complete missed tasks, thus leading them to a solid sense of self. Having already been in alternative education for 14 years before joining CEDU, I was overwhelmed with excitement to be able to be a part of Mel's dream. He became my mentor, a living inspiration demonstrating that there is a giant within each of us seeking expression in the light of day. The contributions that he and Bridget made to the hundreds of faculty staff, and thousands of students, parents and families, and schools cannot be spelled out in these few wanting words of tribute. Great men and women are soon forgotten by the masses. However, the words, ideas, philosophy and institutions created by them remain. The impact of Mel Wasserman's revolutionary contribution to education lives on in the lives of the individuals and the schools to bear his imprint. If there was ever a book worthy of writing, it would be A Golden Age, Mel Wasserman's CEDU Education. On behalf of those touched by your life, thank you, Mel, for the gift. Dan Earl participated in the CEDU schools from 1975 to 1990. During this time, he held many positions, including the founding headmaster of Rocky Mountain Academy, headmaster of the CEDU school and co-president of the CEDU schools. Mel Wasserman, founder of CEDU Education, on the night of April 28, 2002. In October 2004, 4 lawsuits are filed against CEDU schools in Bonner County, Sandpoint, Idaho. There are over 24 families who are party to the suit. Also in 2004, parents search for their son who ran away from CEDU Running Springs. His name was Daniel Ewan. He was never found. You can find out more about Daniel, his family, and CEDU by listening to the podcast, The Lost Kids. On February the 15th, 2005, Rocky Mountain Academy is closed permanently. An article available on strugglingteens.com reads, "Over the past 3 years, the management of CEDU Education has laboured tirelessly in the search for effective leadership for Rocky Mountain Academy and in implementing a curriculum that would deliver only the best emotional growth education for the students. In many respects, we were successful. However, we failed to recruit and place at Rocky Mountain Academy a school director with the skills to manage a cohesive group of staff. Our leadership shortfalls created a negative marketplace opinion that made it difficult to build a census for successful school operation," explained CEDU Education President and Chief Operating Officer Bob Naples. Naples added, "Most recently, we have received resignations from several key staff members. It would be difficult to replace these positions in a timely manner, and to allow us the assurances that our students would be safe and continue to receive a solid emotional growth education. That being said, it is with the best interest of the students of Rocky Mountain Academy to close the school and find alternative placements for them." At this time, Rocky Mountain Academy presently has 19 students enrolled in the program. The company is committed to finding the right program for each of the displaced students and to assist families in relocating their child. This has been an emotional decision for everyone involved, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that we are in the business of helping children, and by closing Rocky Mountain Academy, we will better serve these students with alternative placements and can put our resources into our successful schools and programs. We have 8 therapeutic programs that are viable, successful, and are staffed with experienced individuals. Each has a unique signature and is doing an outstanding job of serving the needs of their children and their programs," said Naples. A number of the employees affected by the closure will be offered other positions within the company. Some will leave the company. Those leaving the company will receive severance. There are plans to create a museum to permanently capture the history of Rocky Mountain Academy, its students and faculty. Rocky Mountain Academy will be closing its doors effective as of Monday, February the 14th. At that time, it is expected that all students will have transferred to other programs. If not, the company will care for them until an appropriate placement is found. CEDU Education's boarding schools, therapeutic wilderness programs, and transitional living programs located in California, Idaho, and Vermont. CEDU Education's boarding schools, therapeutic wilderness program, and transitional living program are located in California, Idaho, and Vermont, and accommodate the diverse needs of families searching for solutions for a child struggling academically, behaviourally, and/or emotionally. The company has a 37-year history of helping families in crisis. Another article written by thespokesman.com by Susan Drumheller reads, "The former flagship of behavioural schools in North Idaho has hoisted the white flag. Rocky Mountain Academy in Naples, Idaho, will close its doors Monday. About 20 staff members will be laid off, and its remaining 19 students will disperse to other institutions or return home, according to CEDU Educational Services, which owns the school. Rocky Mountain Academy, which opened in 1982, was the first CEDU emotional growth boarding school in North Idaho and the catalyst to an industry of behavioral schools for troubled teens in the Panhandle and neighbouring Sanders County, Montana. In the 1990s, the academy housed as many as 140 students from all over the nation. As recently as October, the boarding school had about 40 students and will close with just 19 left. Bob Naples, CEDU's education president and chief operating officer, pinned the school's demise on the company's inability to find effective leadership. In addition, 4 key staff members recently resigned. It would be difficult to replace these positions in a timely manner and to allow us assurances that our students would be safe and continue to receive a solid emotional growth program, Naples said in a prepared statement. CEDU has 5 other programs in North Idaho and employs about 500 people who now serve 163 students. Rocky Mountain's closure does not affect the other programs, except for the few staff members and students who may have to move to the other 2 schools, Boulder Creek Academy and Northwest Academy. Tuition is about $5,700 a month. Bonners Ferry Mayor Darrell Kirby said he didn't know the particulars of the school closing, but said his primary concern was for the staff members who would lose their livelihood and the impact on the community. CEDU is among the top 5 or 10 employers in Boundary County, he noted. The company also operates a short-term intervention program in North Idaho, as well as Ascent, a 6-week wilderness program, and Milestones, a transition program for students 18 and older. Other CEDU programs are in California and Vermont. Recent litigation filed by several families against CEDU was not a factor in the closure of Rocky Mountain Academy. More than 24 parents filed lawsuits against Rocky Mountain Academy and Boulder Creek Academy in October, alleging misconduct and breach of contract issues. The plaintiffs allege, among other complaints, that one boy was forced to dig a grave and lie in a closed coffin in the grave while staff members tossed dirt on it. They also allege that staff members called students degrading names such as whore and fatty, and failed to intervene when students were hazed or beaten by other students. At the time the lawsuit was filed, the plaintiff's attorney told the Spokesman Review one concern was the lack of direction. From our perspective, the problem was Rocky Mountain Academy was going through schools' directors so quickly, nothing has been consistent, attorney Todd Reed said. Lon Woodbury, a former Rocky Mountain Academy staff member who is now a referral specialist for emotional growth programs, said that the academy's reputation was hurting, but not because of the lawsuits. They seem to have lost themselves and haven't been able to turn it around, he said. It's been a lack of leadership. They've had a couple, 3 administrators, and for one reason or another, it didn't work out. In November 2002, CEDU paid a $300,000 settlement in another lawsuit filed by the families of 2 former students who alleged that the staff at Northwest Academy were poorly trained and abusive. That lawsuit was filed following a riot at Northwest Academy in 1997. As Northwest Academy's enrollment eclipsed that of Rocky Mountain Academy's, the schools swapped campuses. Northwest Academy is located on the original grounds of Rocky Mountain Academy in Paradise Valley, next to Boulder Creek Academy. Rocky Mountain Academy's current site in Naples will close, but CEDU will maintain the grounds. It's too soon to say what its future use will be. Meanwhile, CEDU plans to establish a museum at the original campus featuring old Rocky Mountain Academy newspapers, photographs and memorabilia, such as the banners each class made when they graduated from the school. It's helped a lot of families and students, a staff member was quoted saying. It's not surprising here that things were not done sooner around CEDU when the mayor is worried about the staff of these places and not the countless lawsuits about abuse that are coming out of CEDU. The research around this has been incredibly infuriating because, as Medium Anonymous had found out, the same allegations had gone all the way back to the 60s. Yet people are worried about not being able to find cohesive staff members, which I'm guessing meant staff members who were not willing to abuse children and put them in graves and make them endure horrible screaming sessions at one another. But I continue. March 24th, 2005, CEDU staff are informed that they would not be paid for the previous pay period. And the next day, on Good Friday, the Board of Directors of Brown Schools votes for and files the Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Most of the children at many of the schools are sent home, and CEDU finally closes its doors. But that's not where the story ends. In 2009, a police investigation is conducted into the unsupervised presence of the convicted killer James Lee Crummell on the CEDU Running Springs campus in connection with the 2 disappearances in the 1990s. In 2012, the first book about CEDU is published by Waxlight Press. It's called The Discarded Ones, a novel based on a true story by James Tipper, and it marks the first detailed account of life at the school in literature. In 2015, Dead, Insane or in Jail, a CEDU memoir written by Zach Bonney is published. I have personally read this book and I will reference it in our next episode, but I highly recommend this piece of work. In 2020, Adam Egypt, an actor and comedian known for his work with Norm Macdonald, talked about his experiences with CEDU on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. Adam described CEDU as an abusive cult and talks about multiple examples of child endangerment he saw firsthand as a child who was sent to a CEDU camp. He also says in the interview that one of the counsellors was arrested for murdering several of the children. The counsellor had made it look like the children had simply run away. This is the history of CEDU. This is just the outline and what can be found in newspapers and headlines. This doesn't describe in any detail the horrific abuse that children were subjected to on a daily basis. Some of the headlines may have caught your attention as they include themes of child abuse, missing children, murder, assault, suicide and rioting. So are you asking yourselves yet, why and how did these things happen? And why was it only through bankruptcy that CEDU was closed? Within these boarding schools, or therapeutic treatment centres, the same Synanon approaches were used. Synanon had the game, and CEDU had raps. Medium Anonymous explains in his article called Running My Anger, which you can find on medium.com, there is one difference between raps and the game. Raps were facilitated by predatory adults attempting to uncover shameful secrets in children, secrets most of us didn't have. Regardless, after getting blown away, we were forced to run our anger, stare at the carpet and scream our brains out, and make confessions. Once we had run our feelings, a counsellor's bullying rage would move on to the next child. Throughout hundreds of flamboyant rap sessions, every resident learned a central fact of CEDU. Lies couldn't be disentangled from personal development. Chuck Dederick would have been pleased. According to Synanon.org, lying and exaggerating were listed amongst his favourite techniques in the game. Synanon also had the Trip, a session of the game that lasted an entire weekend, sometimes longer, where participants were subjected to sleep-deprived bouts of euphoria and despair during LSD trips. These were also used in CEDU, minus the LSD, and given a new name. As well as raps, the curriculum was divided by workshops called profetes, a rite of passage from one level of the program to the next. Students were not grouped by their grade or age, but rather in peer groups based upon when they arrived at the school. Approximately every 6 months, each peer group would go through a profete, and most of them would advance into the next level of CEDU shortly after. These levels were known as Discovery, 0 to 6 months, Quest, 6 months to 1 year. After that, Challenge, 1 year to a year and a half. Then New Horizons, 1 year and a half to 2 years. And finally Summit, for the last months of the program. At any time, a student could be held back a peer group, repeat profetes, and have their overall time in the program extended for non-compliance. Heather Harding writes on youthrights.org, there were 7 24-hour profetes based off of chapters in the Khalil Gibran book, The Prophet, and 2 workshops, a 3-day and a 6-day. The profetes get their name because they were learning to put feet under the Prophet and supposedly learning tools that would later help us succeed in life. Here is a list of profetes in order through the program. The Truth Prophet is done in Discovery, and the Children's Prophet is also done in Discovery. The Brothers is done in Quest, with a 1-week wilderness course also done in Quest. The Prophets covered in Challenge are The Dreams, The One I Want to Live, and the 2-week wilderness course. The Prophets then covered in New Horizons are The Values, The Image, The I and Me, which is covered over 3 days. And lastly, The Summit, which is 6 days long. The basic outline of profetes were the same during the 24-hour period, but the intensity and harshness increased with each one. The basic outline, your peer group, enters a secluded building away from the rest of the school at around 5 p.m. All the windows are covered, so you never know what time it is. The kids would sit in a semicircle of hard chairs, with one of the faculty members at the front in a plush armchair. Dirt lists are written, and disclosure circles start. A few emotional growth-based exercises and bioenergetic exercises are done with the attempt to weaken you. These experiences are usually harsh in nature, and the faculty will take personal experiences from you and berate you with them. For example, if you were molested by an uncle, they would yell something around the lines, "Yeah, you deserved it. You asked for it because you are a whore." Most were physical and emotionally humiliating. A certain song designed for each prophet would be played repeatedly for hours on end. Around 2 or 3 a.m., a rap is then started. You would only be allowed to wear a short-sleeved shirt, sweatpants and socks. The room was kept around 50 degrees at night, and faculty would come up behind you and slap their hands really loud if you were to fall asleep and make you stand behind your chair. This rap would end around 6 or 7 a.m, where you would have some meaningless uplifted exercise, eat a small breakfast, take a nap for 1 hour or so. The rest of the prophet, which was about 6 hours, was designed to build you back up. The next day, exercises were usually soft in nature. Unfortunately, the emotional trauma, physical exhaustion, and undernourishment would defeat any feel-good moment. You would exit the prophet around 5 p.m. the next day and reintroduce yourself to the school and share your new profound personal wisdom. It is, through all of my Synanon research, it is eerie and scary how similar this sounds to the game and the trip. And it's incredulous to me that CEDU continued to say that it was not linked to Synanon in any way. Nearly all music was forbidden, and listening to it was a punishable offence. CEDU had its own list of approved music, and it played this non-stop on repeat during what Medium Anonymous described as hysterically violent large group awareness trainings. I wonder if survivors hear these songs today and it is still a trigger for them. The soft rock sounds of Neil Diamond and John Denver. A CEDU brochure in the 1970s describes their use of music this way. Music is used extensively as a tool to experience feelings. What isn't mentioned here is that the feelings experienced are usually those of anxiety, depression, fear, anger, and sadness during these intense rap sessions. When therapists and the courts are suggesting that your child attends the, quote, best place for depression treatment, it's unlikely that parents are going to question the actions of professionals, nor are they likely to request information on the qualifications and training from the staff at CEDU. You might be wondering how parents would allow their children to endure such experiences. But children were only allowed phone calls every 2 weeks, and these were monitored by a family liaison officer who would be present for the entire 15 minutes that you were allowed to speak to your parents. When children begged to come home, crying, getting themselves in a state, the liaison officer would later ring your parents back, ensuring them that things were fine, and later on, you would be berated in a rap session. Medium Anonymous describes the family liaison officer as manipulative, as they stressed to parents on a phone call the importance of family separation for this program to be a success. Medium also explains in his article about his parents' hesitation to send him to CEDU, but that another family that they knew had sent their child to CEDU and explained that the program had saved their family. There's no conclusive evidence that I could find that suggests CEDU ever worked in the way that it promised it would. And ironically, even after everything that Charles Dederick did for Synanon, he was still found in a drunken stupor when law enforcement came to arrest him for conspiracy to commit murder. CEDU promised emotional growth, but all it seemed to do was create liars within Synanon, children who would say anything during their torment just to get it over with. So this family praises CEDU, and even goes on to start something called Friends of CEDU, which helps those wanting to send their children, but can't afford to. To me, it sounds more like confirmation bias than tangible results based on actual evidence. Medium Anonymous explains that his family actually took a loan out from American Education to be able to send him to CEDU, and that his parents were still paying it back years after CEDU had closed its doors. Medium also goes on to explain other cultish happenings at CEDU. Upon arrival, you have most of your personal belongings taken away from you. Only plain clothes are allowed. Nothing with a logo is permitted. Everyone dresses pretty much the same. CEDU has its own loaded language, so anyone wearing clothing with a logo or brand were out of agreement, which essentially means out of agreement with CEDU's rules, which was a punishable offence. The punishments and other lingo I do plan to get into in the next episodes for the most part, as the survivors tell us their stories. Also, upon arrival, children are cavity searched. For one stretch of time, many young boys were searched by the same male staff member. This man had allegations of paedophilic behaviour. Despite this, at the time that Medium Anonymous wrote his article, this man was still working with kids in a private school in Pennsylvania. Parents and children have since reached out to survivors of CEDU, speaking of sexual secrets around this male member of staff. This particular information reminded me of a documentary that I watched recently called Athlete A, where a man is put into a position of power with unlimited and private access to young girls, where, as their physician, he was unmonitored and carried out years of sexual abuse to countless young children who trusted him. The maintenance of the grounds was also carried out by children of CEDU. This struck me as particularly familiar with Synanon. Once children were fully obedient within CEDU, they were given special privileges, such as taking parents of new recruits on tours of CEDU. Children were proud and pleased to be given these opportunities. This is a sign of full indoctrination into this movement, and I believe that it is at this time that staff believe they have been successful. One last strange thing about CEDU that I want to mention before leaving the rest to explain in the interviews next time is something known as smushing. Medium Anonymous explains this in his article. I do, however, remember the nightly smushing. Before bedtime, boys, girls, and counsellors collapsed together in the Walter Houston Lodge and embraced. Mandatory or forced adult-to-teen and teen-to-teen cuddling is how a CEDU member described the wildly perverse CEDU protocol. I can't think coherently about smushing, so let me describe an old photo posted on a Flickr account. A male resident, maybe 15 years old, is sitting on one of those cushy couches, cradling a male counsellor. The boy stares directly at the camera with what I hope is a forced smile. His arms are reaching down to the counsellor's abdomen. The counsellor, in his 30s, is leaning back between the boy's legs with one hand languidly holding the boy's bicep. They look like a happy couple on a NAMBLA retreat. The counsellor is resting his head on the boy's shoulder. His hair is brushing against the boy's cheek. He seems wheezily and relaxed, but dazed looking, like he might reprimand the photographer for taking this picture, or he might ask for more. This counsellor, almost a decade later, would perform my cavity search. Everyone participated in smushing. The person tearing you to pieces during the afternoon's group therapy might have a chin on your trousers during the nighttime cuddle. This forced no boundaries and often inappropriate affection was considered expected behaviour, a wiki entry on CEDU lingo and activities explains. On the Lost Kids podcast, former staff member Randolph Reynolds speaks to Josh Block, the podcast host. When he talks of CEDU, he cries. Not because of the pain, anguish and abuse inflicted on children at CEDU, but because of the lives he believes they were truly saving, and the important and powerful work that he thinks they did at CEDU. He says he thinks about CEDU every day. He also says in an interview with Medium Anonymous that, in general, we were treated the same. Staff not only forced these truth-telling rap sessions on the children of CEDU, they actively and passionately joined in, running their own anger and telling their own stories of drug abuse, sexual encounters and failures, all extremely inappropriate for adults to be openly sharing with children. As some of the staff would be made up by CEDU graduates or former residents, I can only assume that the staff were also complicitly and completely indoctrinated into this cult, the only difference being that they wanted to be there, exactly like the squares of Synanon, and that they would force these experiences on children who didn't have a choice, much like the teens ordered to go to Synanon through the courts. children who were also physically and mentally abused. Synanon was responsible for CEDU, but CEDU birthed its own monster. I found a flowchart that explains exactly how the roots of Synanon grabbed a hold of America and spawned the so-called troubled teen industry. Synanon, 1958 to 1991, pioneered the use of harsh behaviour modification techniques. From this, DATOP was formed. From 1963 and still ongoing today, it is an anti-drug program with teen units. The founder allegedly saw possibilities in Synanon. From DATOP, the Elan School was formed from 1970 and also is still present today. There is a website called elan.school which contains a graphic novel called Joe vs. Elan School, where Joe depicts his life in Elan, which basically mirrors CEDU. It starts with the middle of the night kidnapping, where Joe is woken and forced into a car to be taken to the school. I wonder if this was carried out by Bill Lane Associates and his troubled teen transport service. I reached out to Joe, but he apologised, saying that he was too busy to come and interview with me, but he encouraged me to reference his work. From Synanon, Phoenix House was also spawned, from 1967, and is still going today with 100 sites in 9 states, including residential academies for teens. From this, the Seed opened from 1970 until 2001. Investigators likened its methods to brainwashing in 1974. But from the Seed, Straight Inc. was born. From 1976 until 1993, Nancy Reagan's favourite anti-drug program. It eventually closed because of abuse lawsuits. Again though, from Straight Inc., Kids Inc. and Family Pathway Centre opened. Kids Inc. from 1984 until 1998 paid out $10 million in child abuse settlements, whilst Pathway Family Centre was founded by Straight Inc. staff, even though Straight Inc. was closed down after abuse cases. Also from Synanon, boot camps opened. Synanon opened the first teen boot camp in the mid-70s. Nearly 100 boot camps for young offenders launched in the 80s and 90s. Also from Synanon, wilderness programs were created. The first wilderness program for troubled teens started in 1946. Several included Challenger, Summit Quest and North Star Expedition, which have closed in the wake of kids' deaths. Christian programs were also born. Tough Love with a religious twist. This includes New Horizons, Youth Ministries and Love in Action, which I actually spoke about in my conversion therapy history episode. These models use the Straight Inc. model to, quote, cure gay teens. Behaviourist programs are also now a tangent of Synanon, along with Worldwide Association of Speciality Programs, which is currently being sued for abuse by former residents. Going back to conversion therapy camp, in the Vice documentary We Went to Gay Conversion Therapy Camp, you can see staff using scream therapy with their chairs lined out in semicircles, and then afterwards they cuddle with each other, almost like a rap followed by smushing. The discredited practice of trying to change the gender identity or sexuality of a person, which often targets under 18s, is covered in this episode. Again, this industry is profiting off of the backs and abuse of kids. I even recently read an article on a phenomenon known as attachment therapy, where one young girl lost her life. TheGuardian.com released a 2001 article that reads, "The Therapy That Killed." Imagine 4 adults whose combined weight is nearly 10 times your own, wrapping you in a blanket and sitting on you. It is a controversial therapy called rebirthing, used in the US to treat children with behavioural problems. Only now, one of those children has died, suffocated despite her screams for help. Audrey Gillen reports from Washington. Wednesday, 20th of June, 2001. Candice Elizabeth Newmaker seemed like an average 10-year-old girl, all blue eyes, freckles and curly brown hair. Before she became a Newmaker, she had been Candice Tiara Elmore, daughter of a teenage mother and violent father, and resident of a number of different ramshackle homes and trailers in a North Carolina backwater. Her adoption at the age of 5 by Jean Newmaker, a 14-year-old unmarried nurse, was supposed to change not only her name, but her life. It was supposed to provide her life with the certainty that a fragile mother and 6 different foster homes never could. At first, it did. Candice got the pink bicycle, the riding, swimming and gym lessons, the ice skating and slumber parties, but her adoption would also lead to her death. Candice was suffocated in a bizarre process known as rebirthing that cost around 5,000 English pounds. Wrapped up in a blanket meant to represent a womb, the little girl was sat on by 4 adults until she could no longer breathe. She screamed for oxygen and told them she was dying, and the whole terrible procedure was watched by her new mum. On April 20th, 2 unlicensed therapists, Connell Watkins and Julie Ponder, were found guilty of reckless child abuse resulting in death. On Monday, a judge sentenced them to 16 years in prison, the minimum sentence they could have received. Newmaker and the 2 assistants present during the little girl's ordeal are scheduled to go on trial later this year. Her birth parents had called her Candice because they heard the name on television, and Tiara because she was a jewel, but Newmaker says Candice was no gem, no average 10-year-old. She said the child had psychological problems so advanced that she started a fire in her own home, regularly flew into hour-long rages, and once sexually assaulted 2 children. She confided in friends that Candice was a handful and assaultive, and told the court, "I thought she was deteriorating before my very eyes. I was not prepared for the level of dysfunction I saw in Candice." She says that Candice became extremely defensive at home, extremely negative, and once pulled down a floor-to-ceiling bookcase, smashing Newmaker's beloved glass horses. Teachers remember a different child, one who was not badly behaved, but Newmaker felt Candice was so behaviourally disordered that she first put her on mood-altering drugs, then turned to a controversial therapy, believing Candice suffered from reactive attachment disorder, known as RAD, an increasingly popular diagnosis of extreme behaviour in children which is said to affect thousands of adoptive families. The condition has divided the scientific and therapeutic communities and has sparked this question: is the syndrome being used as an excuse for bad parenting, or is it a little understood but growing phenomenon? Those who believe RAD exists, and many in the US do, claim that affected children cannot bond with their parents. That often they steal, lie, torture pets, hit their parents, hit themselves, and lapse into extreme rages. With rebirthing, the idea is to turn back the clock and allow the child to bond. A kind of holding therapy, it involves a child lying across the laps of, or being contained by, parents or therapists or both. Often the child becomes angry, and this is when the therapists tighten their grip. The aim is to show the children that someone who can control them and that they can feel safe at the same time. Newmaker said, I knew it was provocative therapy. I thought it was our only chance. The unofficial home of attachment therapists is the mountainside town of Evergreen, Colorado. It was here that Candice was taken in April 2000 in a desperate attempt to control her behaviour. After a 2-week course, she would be reborn. While there, she was subjected to a 3-hour session of rebirthing during which she was told to imagine yourself as a teeny baby inside your mother's womb and what it felt like. A videotape of the session shows Candice telling the adults in the room that she had a vague memory of being dropped from a window 2 flights up, that she had a nightmare last night in which she was murdered by her mother. She says she wants to feel safe. The little girl was told to scream and cry like a baby and wriggle out of the blanket and away from the people lying on top of her. They said, "You're going to go through the birth canal," and promised, while you are in the womb, you'll have plenty of air to breathe. The 4 adults, weighing a total of 673 pounds against Candice's 70, began to apply pressure. In the video, Candice is heard to say, "Whoever is pushing on my head, it's not helping." Later she says, "I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't breathe, I can't breathe." A minute later, the child says she was going to die. She screams, "Please, please stop pushing. I can't breathe. Okay, I'm dying. I'm sorry." At this point, the therapist shouts, "You want to die? Okay, then die. Go ahead, die right now." 20 minutes later, still begging for help, Candice says, "Please, you said you would give me some oxygen, and I'm throwing up. I just threw up. I've got to poop. I've got to poop." Still, the adults keep going, calling her a quitter and a twerp, telling her that she gets to be stuck in her own puke and poop. Finally, they ask Candice if she wants to be reborn. No, she says, it is the last word she ever utters. When the blanket is removed, Candice is blue. After a night on life support at a children's hospital, the little girl who had dreamed of being murdered dies from brainstem herniation and cerebral edema, brought on by mechanical asphyxiation. 11 times she had told the adults that she was going to die. In a statement in court, Connell Watkins said Candice's death is a tragedy and so is her life. "I think of her story as being an American tragedy because there are thousands of children in this country today who have suffered trauma during their first 2 years of life. They will also be misdiagnosed and mistreated and ineffectively treated for years. Many of them, if they're lucky, will be adopted by loving parents, much like Jean Newmaker, and they will devote all their resources and all their energies to help heal their children from the emotional and behavioural problems that they didn't create, and when and if they fail, they will be blamed. Candice is the only child to have died during rebirthing, but attachment disorder has featured as a defence in a number of recent trials. In 1997, Renee Paul Reese was sentenced to 22 years in prison for the death of her adopted son, David. She argued that he was not beaten to death with a wooden spoon, but suffered from RAD, which made him impossible to control and caused him to mutilate himself. Joseph and Heather Chambroni claimed that RAD led to the death in 1995 of their adopted son Lucas, who was covered in more than 200 bruises when he was taken to hospital. They too said the wounds were self-inflicted. Joseph was sentenced to life imprisonment. Heather will go on trial later this summer and will plead insanity. RAD first appeared as a recognised psychiatric disorder in 1980 and is defined by the American Psychiatric Association as markedly disturbed and developmentally inappropriate social relatedness. While most researchers acknowledge that the syndrome exists, many argue that it's overdiagnosed and has led to the emergence of an entire industry of profit-motivated therapists with unproven treatments. Thais Tepper, of the Parent Network for the Post-Institutionalized Child, believes RAD exists but says rebirthing is not the way to cope with it. There is no basis in science for this treatment. How can screaming at a 10-year-old and torturing her until she accepts another woman as her mother really forge any kind of bond? Candice will now be remembered by Candice's Law, which outlaws rebirthing as a treatment in the state of Colorado. Back in a trailer at the end of a muddy lane in Hickory, North Carolina, Candice's real mother, Angie, who has 5 other children, says, "They smothered her. That was my daughter. How did she die from a blanket? Isn't that why they say don't put pillows on babies? Don't put bags by them. It's stupid. It's stupid. You don't put a child under a pillow and push it on her." Despite all of the abuse allegations and CEDU closing down, others go on to remember it fondly. Not just the news articles that we've covered, not just people praising Mel Wasserman, but a group of people in general that look back on CEDU with a sort of sentimentality. Ronell Hansen, an admissions director from Bonners Ferry, Idaho, wrote a report in the April 1993 issue of the Woodbury Reports file, which is now archived and accessible on strugglingteens.com. With a long-stemmed rose in one hand and a lit candle in the other, the 9 students somberly stood in front of the rest of the student body. They had just completed the summit workshop, and this was the traditional ceremony of returning to the school community. After a week of intensive work on their emotional growth in the summit workshop, which was on top of more than 2 years of emotional, mental, and physical growth, in the Rocky Mountain Academy program, these students exuded poise, confidence, and excitement for their upcoming graduation and post-RMA future. Bright-eyed, freshly scrubbed, and dressed neatly, these young adults at that moment would have made any parent in America proud, especially considering how fearful, angry, and out of control the students had been when they first enrolled. Then, with the sudden crashing of music as a cue, they radically changed the mood and burst into enthusiastic dancing as an expression of the enthusiasm they felt, rapidly bringing the rest of the students into dancing. As a side note, this is exactly what happened at the end of the trip in Synanon. Soon, almost everyone in the room was dancing, but I could see an obvious difference between the Summit graduates and the rest of the students. The Summit graduates seemed more centered, more spontaneous, with less self-consciousness in their dancing than the rest of the students. The dancing was followed by brief talks by each of the 9, reporting on what they had just experienced. The sense of accomplishment and experienced feelings was so deep that words failed them. This returning ceremony from a profit/workshop is symbolic of the heart of the Rocky Mountain Academy program. For years, it has been the crying need for emotional growth which has been the primary reason students are enrolled there by their parents. The only way to describe an RMA child is one who is emotionally stuck at an earlier age. These are children who missed basic lessons vital to responsible adulthood, such as how to make good friends, the importance of truth, how cause and effect work, how to live by values, and avoiding self-destructive behaviour. Having missed these lessons, they are making bad decisions. To meet their needs, each RMA child goes through 9 24-hour-plus profit/workshops, of which the Summit workshop is the last one just before graduation. Each profit/workshop focuses on one of the basic lessons a child needs to learn to become an effective and functioning adult. Profits have been the heart of the RMA emotional growth curriculum for all of its existence. These are supplemented by individual counselling when appropriate, and groups, which RMA call RAPs, which occur up to 3 times a week. Add to this the work ethic from a working farm, the school's form of experiential education, outdoor and wilderness activities, and you have a school focused on helping those students grow up who missed the early vital lessons. The above is a description, largely from the Rocky Mountain Academy. Rocky Mountain Academy had traditionally been adequate, but always less emphasised than the emotional growth part of the programme. There are signs Rocky Mountain Academy is now making a more serious effort to make their education more effective for the unique needs of their students. The teachers are very open to applying the results of research on learning behaviour, and conversations were filled with references to theories and research. The concerns many educational consultants have with recent RMA changes revolves around the change in admissions policy, which is to consider and sometimes enrol a student on psychotropic medication. The school is now also open to the possibility some of these students might not be weaned off medication and would need to be maintained on it throughout their stay at Rocky Mountain Academy. One main reason this has become an issue with RMA is probably because RMA was so adamant and purist in its past policy of no medicated students. Many other schools have made this swift without it becoming an issue, but none of them had been so successful while being so adamant in screening out children on medication. Rob Spear, RMA president, says the only change in the school is to expand the types of students RMA can successfully work with. RMA has always been a dynamic and changing school, with all the tensions that change brings about. I, for one, the author, will be watching this latest change with the question, is it still the same RMA with expanded capabilities, or is something basic being changed? There are others who do not regret any of the events that took place within CEDU. Former employees, directors, CEOs, and any adults seemingly involved in CEDU have never apologised publicly to the children that suffered at their hands. And when asked, these same adults still say they believed that they had saved lives. Lon Woodbury himself would even go on to write his own sentimental piece that's available on strugglingteens.com. It reads, "Those of us old enough to remember the 1960s will recall a decade of tremendous change, creativity and turmoil. It was a turning point decade, a time when many of the old attitudes were cast off and new directions taken, At least one national social critic has asserted that when you look at the things going wrong in this country today, they all come out of the 60s. On the other hand, many of our most respected contemporary values were products of the 60s. In education and personal growth, a tremendous amount of creativity and new thinking began in the 60s. Traditional public and private education thinking was widely challenged. The traditional interventions for emotional and behavioural problems of juvenile detention or hospitalisation were criticised as harmful all too often. Storefront schools and other experimental and experiential forms of education flourished as they tried to break away from the traditional model of education founded on the concept of the factory in the early years of the 20th century. In personal growth, we saw Lifespring and Synanon, a variety of Eastern mystic ideas brought to this country, and a host of other movements with new visions of how to increase human potential. In addition, the concept of individual therapy provided by credentialed therapists, rooted in at least the trappings of science and credentials, finally became accepted legally and culturally. This was marked by the legal acceptance of alcoholism as a disease in 1962, rather than the old view of it being a moral problem. The 1960s was a cornucopia of new ideas and experimentation, starting a process of developing, interacting, and evolving to find better ways to educate and help young people. The network of emotional growth, therapeutic tools, and programs this newsletter focuses on evolved directly out of the experimentation going on in the 1960s. Part of this experimentation was to establish schools for at-risk adolescents as private alternatives with parental choice for enrolment decisions. These influences are still evident. It is these roots in the experimentation of the 60s that make this network unique from other education and mental health association and networks. Many of the people and schools who started working with struggling teens during the creativity of the 1960s are still around. Larry Dean Olson, founder of Anasazi Foundation, discovered that students at Brigham Young University did better academically after going on one of his wilderness experiences in the late 60s. And Larry Wells, founder of Wilderness Quest, found that taking young Idaho prisoners into the wilderness in the early 1970s reduced recidivism rates drastically. In addition, many of the programs in Montana were founded by people who had worked at or been inspired by Spring Creek Community School, a backwoods alternative school founded by Steve Caudry in the late 60s, early 70s. Caudry closed the school down several years ago, but its influence remains. The late Mel Wasserman founded the CEDU school in 1967, and CEDU probably had the most widespread influence on this network. Originally, Wasserman saw how many of the young people he met around his hometown of Palm Springs, California in the mid-60s were living in total chaos. They had real problems with drugs, relationships, and parents, and from the standard institutions and interventions of the time, there was nothing available to effectively help them. He decided to go into the school business. He founded CEDU specifically as an alternative school, designed to provide what these confused young people desperately needed. His genius was in selecting from the currents of experimentation floating around in the 60s. Those elements that created a whole child education system by addressing their physical, mental, and emotional growth. The term emotional growth came out of CEDU. CEDU became extremely successful in helping young people as an alternative to therapeutic institutions. CEDU expanded to establish several North Idaho schools by the 1990s and added the 2 schools currently in California. More importantly, many people who worked at CEDU left to establish their own schools or took key positions in other schools, adding their own personal ideas to what they had learned at CEDU. A significant number of the schools in the emotional growth and therapeutic schools and programs network are developed or strongly influenced by people who were originally inspired by the CEDU experience. Another early school was Elan in Poland Springs, Maine. Established in 1970, Elan was strongly influenced by the behavioural concepts prevalent at the time, developing into an extremely tightly structured behavioural modification school. Although Elan itself has not grown beyond the one school, I have met several people elsewhere in the Northeast who had once worked there. It seems Elon's approach differed from the norm, and it opened people up to the idea that there were ways beyond the traditional to construct a school or program for struggling teens, and they proceeded to act on that insight. Provo Canyon School in Provo, Utah was founded in 1971. Although a secure treatment center, they employed several new ideas, including thinking of themselves as a school and referring to their residents as students instead of patients. Today, there are many schools and programs in Utah that were either founded by people who had once worked for Provo Canyon School or learned the business from an ex-employee of Provo Canyon School. Other important influences were Campbell Loftmiller and his book Wilderness Road, published in 1965. From his work with a salesmanship club near Dallas, this book and the salesmanship club found a kid's behavior gets better after camping out. Primarily influential in the Southeast, this concept of long-term camping inspired the Three Springs program and the Eckerd programs, along with a number of other small programs. So what's my point? First, if you start tracing the history of influences on many of the schools in the network of emotional growth or therapeutic schools and programs, you usually wind up back to just a handful of early founders. Also, much of what is successful and creative in the schools and programs is this network that came directly out of the creative thinking and experimenting that occurred in the 1960s. And regards to Bill Lane, Kathy Nussberger has nothing but good things to say about him. She writes in an article, "Great sense of humour and quick wit describes the fun side of Bill Lane, but you can't help but feel the deep dedication and loyalty Bill has for the families and students he served for 31 years as he worked at CEDU Family of Services. Today, he continues to serve those families with his new company, Bill Lane and Associates." Bill explained how he met and became friends with CEDU's founder, Mel Wasserman, several years before the first program began. "I met Mel in San Francisco several years before he started CEDU, while I was working for Synanon, a drug rehabilitation center," Bill said. "I remember talking with him about his ideas and thought he might have a better way of working with teens and younger students. But as the years passed, we went our separate ways, with Mel moving to Palm Springs, and I never really thought much more about it until I began hearing a new non-profit organization had opened a school in Running Springs." According to Bill, Mel started the program in 1966, but it was several years after that when Mel approached him about working for CEDU. "A few years after the program opened, I started reading and hearing about it, and we began communicating back and forth, but I was pretty content at Synanon, which was how I became involved in working with all ages from teen to adult," said Bill. However, when Mel asked me to come down and take a look at CEDU, which at the time consisted of a very small school in Running Springs and an office in Los Angeles, I agreed, and was pretty excited about what I saw at the program. He offered me a job and I started working for Mel in January 1974. I was only 9 at the time, he joked. In the early days of his work with CEDU, Bill's expertise was in public relations, fundraising, and he travelled all over the country to locate whatever the program needed. At that time, they had very few private pay. It was mostly adjudicated kids, so I used to work very closely with the families who donated money to the school, he said. But then I began travelling a lot when we needed funding for building projects. If we needed materials, I would move to Oregon for a month and go to every sawmill and lumberyard in the state with a list, and based on that list, I would get them to donate the materials we needed. And after, I would contact trucking companies to get them to donate their services for picking up and hauling the materials to the school. That's how we helped to fund the organisation. If we needed beef, I went to Texas for a month and visited every cattle yard to get the beef. As time went on, Bill moved into admissions and every other aspect of the organisation, culminating in his becoming president of CEDU High and Middle Schools, director of Hilltop, and finally, his ultimate love, director of the transport service CEDU began providing. "I fell into what has become a passion for me. When Mel suggested starting a transport service, I love what we do and the services we have to offer the families. I fell into what has become a passion for me when Mel suggested starting a transport service. I love what we do and the services we have to offer the families, educational consultants, psychiatrists, etc. that I work with throughout the country," Bill explained. Mel approached me about 12 years ago with the idea because it was evident that they were getting a lot of students who required transport services. We felt like we could do a good job of transporting them ourselves, and we could better prepare the students in their understanding of the schools they were coming to. Whenever Mel was considering a new venture, he would say to me, "Bill, look into this, see if it is feasible and if it will work." The transport service was a very successful venture. Bill explained how escorting students to a school is often a very scary situation for both the parents and students, so he quickly addresses the anger and fear and diffuses it by describing the program and explaining what the child may expect upon arrival to the school. "Although the company name is different today, I still have the same employees and implement the same beliefs as I did when CEDU was running the service," he said. "Everyone who works for me is very well trained with CPR and first aid certifications, and although employees must pass both a federal and state background check to escort a student, I employ a lot of people up here in North Idaho. And when CEDU closed down in March, I immediately incorporated under Bill Lane and Associates Inc., and we continued with business as usual." Bill said he also fell into an entire industry that he truly loves. "Quite frankly, going to work for CEDU in the 70s was a godsend to me because it was new, the only place available at that time, and it was a major contributor to spearheading today's movement in the struggling teens industry. A lot of the folks who work in the industry today also worked for CEDU. It's really been a great experience. I wanted to continue doing it even after CEDU closed because working with students and parents is wonderful." When the IECA first started over 20 years ago, Bill said he was one of the first people to bring CEDU to the attention of the educational consultants who were members of the organisation. "Personally, I believe Mel would be devastated by the closure of CEDU schools," Bill said. "I think what's taken place is unconscionable." Mel, as the inspirational big man and visionary, was a very dynamic guy. He knew what he wanted and what he had to do to get it. He was a tough guy to work for on one hand, but also the fairest person I knew, and treated his employees very well, which is why he had one of the biggest programs in the industry. Bill explained that Mel sold CEDU to the Brown schools, and the company was at its peak in the market. All the schools were full and everything was going great. However, after the first and second year the company was owned by the Brown schools, the staff turnover at the highest levels was unbelievable. There was no one left with any time or stability in the company, and the organisation went backwards. Mel saw what was happening, and he would say, "Well, we don't own it anymore," but you could tell that he was very disappointed. The day of the infamous phone call announcing the CEDU closures caught everyone off guard, including Bill, who said he was in the middle of transporting a student to the Ascent program in North Idaho when he was told they couldn't take the boy. I spent time with Mel on his 70th birthday, which was shortly before he died, and I can say that what was done to the parents, students, staff and consultants that day probably made him turn over in his grave. To not give any notice to anyone, especially the parents, students and staff, was unconscionable. The legacy is wounded, but lives on in the industry. The family can't believe what happened to the CEDU name. They are stunned that it progressed to that point because Mel put his heart and soul into that company. This is where I'm going to leave today's episode. We've covered the history of CEDU, and we've spoken about how staff and other adults feel about the industry, the positive light that CEDU was spoken about in the media, and maybe we've shined a light on why parents and why professionals weren't questioning what was happening at CEDU. But the other parts of this series will shine a light on the things that were happening, and we will discuss things that should have been appearing in the newspapers. I feel like we're fully prepared with enough background knowledge to dive into the interviews with the survivors next week. I have left links in the description of resources for support and guidance for anyone who has been affected by the troubled teen industry. This includes links to unbrokensurvivors.com and CEDUlegacy.org, which is an incredible website full of archives of CEDU information and a ton of links for support. If you'd like to get in touch, you can do so by emailing me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or you can get in touch on Instagram and Twitter at cultvaultpod. Again, if you are interested in supporting my content, next month I will be covering the Branch Davidians exclusively for Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/thecultvault. I am your speaker, Casey, and this has been another episode of The Cult Vault.